Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We appreciate you joining us as we explore a predator who hunts not in the shadows, but within the sacred bonds of marriage. The term Black Widow evokes a chilling image, a female who mates only to destroy. In the world of true crime, this archetype is reserved for women who turn companionship into a deadly enterprise. They use vows of love as a prelude to murder, patiently waiting for the moment when trust can be exploited for financial gain. Their method is intimate deception, and their legacy is a string of husbands who discovered too late that their marriage was, in fact, a death sentence. Case 1. The Hell's Princess of Murder Farm. A woman lures suitors to her farm, murdering them for their fortunes. The story of the American Black Widow often begins in the heartland, in a place of supposed simplicity and pastoral virtue. But this particular story begins much earlier, across an ocean, in the cold, stony soil of Selbu, Norway. It was here, in 1859, that Brynhild Paulsdatter Storseth was born. Her early life was one of poverty and hardship, a reality that forged in her a fierce and unyielding ambition. She was a large, physically imposing woman, strong from years of farm labor, with a mind that was sharp and calculating. She dreamed of a life beyond the rigid confines of her small Norwegian village, a life of wealth and independence. America, the land of opportunity, beckoned. In 1881, Brynhild emigrated to the United States, anglicizing her name to the softer, more approachable Belle. She settled in Chicago, joining the bustling community of Scandinavian immigrants, and for a time, her life was one of unremarkable domesticity. She worked as a servant, saved her money, and in 1884, she married a fellow Norwegian immigrant named Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen. They opened a confectionery shop, a sweet facade for a life that would soon be tainted by a bitter and recurring tragedy. The couple had 4 children, Caroline, Axel, Myrtle, and Lucy. And one by one, they began to die. The 2 eldest, Caroline and Axel, both died in infancy, their deaths attributed to acute colitis. Such deaths, while tragic, were not uncommon in the era of primitive sanitation and medicine. But the pattern was unsettling. The confectionery shop, their primary source of income, mysteriously burned to the ground. Conveniently, it was insured, and Belle and Mads collected the payout. It was the first recorded instance of what would become a lifelong business model for Belle, prosperity rising from the ashes of disaster. The final tragedy of Belle's Chicago years was the death of her husband, Mads. On July 30th, 1900, he died. The cause of death was officially listed as cerebral hemorrhage, but the timing was, once again, remarkably convenient. His death occurred on the single day that 2 separate life insurance policies he held happened to overlap. Belle collected on both. The attending physician, who had treated Mads for what he believed was a minor illness, was surprised by his sudden death and suspected he might have been poisoned with strychnine. But no autopsy was performed. Belle, now a grieving widow with a substantial sum of money, was free. With her 2 surviving daughters, Myrtle and Lucy, Belle left Chicago. She used the insurance money to purchase a 40-acre farm on the outskirts of Lawport, Indiana. The property was isolated, surrounded by woods and swamps, a perfect setting for a woman who valued her privacy above all else. The farm would become her kingdom, her fortress, and ultimately her abattoir. In 1902, Belle married again. Her new husband was Peter Gunnes, a local Norwegian widower with 2 young daughters of his own. The marriage was brief. Less than a year after their wedding, Peter Gunnes was dead. Belle's story was that a heavy meat grinder had mysteriously fallen from a high shelf and struck him on the head, killing him instantly. It was a bizarre and implausible explanation, but the local coroner, perhaps swayed by Belle's performance of hysterical grief, ruled the death an accident. Not long after Peter's accident, his infant daughter, who had been living in the house with Belle, also died under mysterious circumstances while in her sole care. Peter's other, older daughter, Jenny, who was around 10 years old, would also vanish from the farm a short time later. When neighbors inquired about Jenny, Belle told them she had been sent away to a boarding school in California. No one ever saw her again. Belle Gunness was once again a widow, now with full control of the farm and another life insurance policy to her name. It was at this point that the true, horrific enterprise of the murder farm began. Belle, now in her 40s, began placing matrimonial advertisements in the Lonely Hearts columns of Scandinavian-language newspapers across the Midwest. Her ads were carefully crafted, designed to appeal to a specific type of man: lonely, middle-aged farmers and laborers of Norwegian descent, men with a lifetime of savings and a desire for companionship. The ads painted a picture of a comely widow living on a trim, fine property, seeking a kind and reliable Norwegian man to share her life. But they all contained a critical, telling caveat. Applicants were instructed to visit her at her farm, and, most importantly, they were told to bring their life savings in cash, to prove their sincerity and to invest in the farm. Triflers need not apply, the ads often concluded. The men came. They arrived in Lawport by train, their pockets filled with cash, their hearts filled with hope. They were met by Belle, a large, smiling woman who welcomed them into her home. They would be seen in town with her for a day or two, perhaps at the bank, cashing in their assets. And then they would disappear. When neighbors or relatives would inquire about the constant stream of male visitors, Belle had a ready supply of explanations. The man had been an unsuitable match and had left. He had gone to visit relatives in another state. He had decided to move on. Her explanations were accepted. She was, after all, a respectable, hard-working widow, a pillar of the local immigrant community. One such suitor was John Moe, from Elbow Lake, Minnesota. He arrived in Lawport with over $1,000. A week later, his family received a letter, supposedly from him, saying he was well and happy. But the letter was not in his handwriting. He was never heard from again. Another was Ole Budsberg, a widower from Wisconsin. He sold his farm, mortgaged his property, and arrived at the Gunness farm with several $1,000s. He, too, vanished. The machine of the murder farm ran with brutal efficiency for years. Men would arrive, be welcomed, and then Belle would serve them a hearty, home-cooked meal. The coffee, it is believed, was often laced with a sedative. Once the man was unconscious or incapacitated, Belle, a woman of formidable physical strength, would end his life, often with a blow to the head from a cleaver or a hammer. Then came the grisly work of butchery. She would dismember the bodies in her cellar, a task for which she had ample experience from her time on farms. The remains were then buried in the soft, loamy soil of her hog pen and garden, or sometimes dissolved in lye. The enterprise might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the persistence of one man. In 1907, a suitor named Andrew Helgilian, a farmer from South Dakota, disappeared after traveling to Lawport to meet Belle. His brother, Assel Helgilian, grew worried when his letters to Andrew went unanswered. He wrote to Belle, who responded with a series of letters, first claiming Andrew was not there, then admitting he had been there but had left. Assel did not believe her. His brother was not the type to disappear. He promised Belle that if his brother was not found, he would come to Lawport himself to investigate. Belle now knew her time was running out. She had another problem as well, a recently fired farmhand named Ray Lamphere. Lamphere was deeply infatuated with Belle and had, by his own later admission, become an unwilling accomplice in her crimes, helping her bury the bodies. When she fired him, he became jealous and angry, making public threats against her. He knew too much. He was a liability. Belle went to the local authorities, claiming Lamphere was a danger to her and her children. She tried to have him declared insane. She told people she feared for her life, that Lamphere had threatened to burn her house down. She was setting the stage for her final act. On the night of April 28, 1908, the Gunness farmhouse went up in flames. The fire raged through the night, consuming the wooden structure completely. When the embers cooled, authorities sifted through the charred ruins. In the cellar, they made a grim discovery: the bodies of 4 people. 3 were clearly children, identified as Belle's children: Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip. The 4th was the body of an adult woman. It was headless. The immediate assumption was that it was the body of Belle Gunness, murdered by the vengeful Ray Lamphere before he set the fire. Lamphere was promptly arrested and charged with murder and arson. The case seemed open and shut. But when Asle Helgelien arrived in Lawport, he insisted that the headless body was not his brother's bride-to-be. It was too small, too slight. Belle was a large, heavy-boned woman. The coroner took measurements and agreed. The body was at least 5 inches shorter and 50 pounds lighter than Belle Gunness. Who, then, was this woman? And where was Belle? Asle, convinced that both his brother and Belle were buried somewhere on the property, persuaded the local sheriff to begin digging. What they unearthed was a scene of horror that surpassed anything the small town of Lawport could have imagined. They started in the hog pen, a place where the ground was soft and disturbed. One after another, they began to find bodies. They found the dismembered remains of Andrew Helgelien. Then they found another body and another. They were wrapped in burlap sacks cut into pieces. The search expanded to the entire farm. The property became a macabre archaeological dig. For weeks, they dug, unearthing a graveyard. They found the remains of at least a dozen people, though the true number will never be known. They found the body of the missing girl, Jenny Olsen. They found men, women, and children. The farm was not a farm, it was a human slaughterhouse. Belle Gunness was not a victim, she was a monster, a hell's princess who had turned her home into a factory of death. Ray Lamphere was put on trial. He was acquitted of murder but found guilty of arson. He was sentenced to prison, where he died of tuberculosis about a year later. Before he died, he gave a full confession to a fellow inmate. He detailed Belle's entire operation, how she lured the men, drugged them, killed them, and dismembered them. He confirmed that she had killed dozens of people for their money. And he delivered the final, chilling piece of the puzzle. The headless body in the cellar was not Belle. It was a victim she had lured to the farm from Chicago, a stand-in for her own death. Belle, he said, had packed her bags with thousands of dollars, set the fire, and fled, vanishing into the night. Did Belle Gunness escape? The question has never been definitively answered. For decades after the fire, there were reported sightings of a woman resembling her all across the country. The dental work found near the headless body was eventually said to be a match for Belle's, but the methods of the time were crude, and the identification has always been disputed. She remains a ghost, a woman who may have successfully engineered her own disappearance after a career of making others disappear permanently. The legacy of Belle Gunness is one of cold, industrial-scale murder, all hidden behind the persona of a lonely, hard-working widow. Her farm stands as a grotesque monument to greed, a place where the search for love was a lure for a death sentence, and where the rich Indiana soil became the final, unmarked resting place for the dozens who answered the call of the Black Widow of Lawport. Case 2. The Black Widow of Pensacola. A woman kills her husband, son, and boyfriend for insurance money. The American South, with its deep traditions of family, faith, and community, can often be a place where the darkest secrets are hidden behind the most respectable facades. In the Florida panhandle city of Pensacola during the 1970s and 80s, one such facade was that of Judy Benoano. To the outside world, she was a resilient and hardworking single mother, a successful businesswoman who ran her own nail salon. She was a woman who had endured an almost unbelievable string of personal tragedies, a figure who elicited sympathy and admiration from those in her community. But the tragedies that seemed to follow Judy Benoano were not a matter of bad luck. They were a matter of meticulous, cold-blooded design. Her story begins with a difficult and fractured childhood. Born Judy Welty in Texas in 1943, she was passed between relatives and foster homes after her mother's death, enduring abuse and neglect that would shape her worldview. This early trauma seemed to instill in her a deep-seated desire for control and financial security, a desire she would pursue with ruthless and homicidal determination. In 1961, at the age of 18, she gave birth to a son, Michael Goodyear. A few years later, she began a relationship with an Air Force sergeant named James Goodyear. They married in 1966, and James adopted Michael as his own. The family settled near Orlando, Florida. James Goodyear was a good man, a decorated Vietnam veteran who provided a stable life for his wife and son. But for Judy, this life was not enough. In 1971, James returned from a tour of duty in Vietnam. Shortly after his return, he began to suffer from a mysterious, debilitating illness. He experienced nausea, vomiting, and a progressive weakness that left him incapacitated. Doctors were baffled. They could not diagnose the cause of his rapid decline. On September 16, 1971, after months of agonizing suffering, Sergeant James Goodyear died. The official cause of death was listed as cardiovascular and renal failure. No one suspected foul play. Judy Benoano, now a grieving military widow, collected on 3 separate life insurance policies totaling over $90,000. She used the money to open her own business, a nail salon, and began to build a new life for herself and her son, Michael. She was seen as a tragic but strong figure, a woman making her own way in the world. A few years later, Judy entered into a new relationship with a man named Bobby Joe Morris. They moved together to Colorado. But Judy's pattern of tragedy continued. In 1978, Bobby Joe Morris, like James Goodyear before him, fell victim to a sudden and inexplicable illness. He suffered the same symptoms: nausea, weakness, and organ failure. He died a short time later. Again, the doctors were unable to pinpoint a cause. Judy, a grieving partner for the second time, collected on his life insurance policy. She moved back to Pensacola, Florida, with her son, Michael. By this point, Michael was a teenager. He was a bright student and a promising athlete. In 1979, however, Michael's life took a tragic and bizarre turn. He enlisted in the U.S. Army, but shortly after his deployment to Fort Benning, Georgia, he, too, fell victim to a mysterious illness. The symptoms were chillingly familiar. He became progressively weaker, his body racked with pain. The military doctors were stumped. Michael was eventually honorably discharged due to his debilitating condition. He returned home to Pensacola, a shadow of his former self, his arms and legs now encased in heavy metal braces. He was a young man whose body was inexplicably failing him. The truth was a secret of unimaginable cruelty. Michael was being slowly and systematically poisoned by his own mother. For years, Judy Benoano had been lacing his food with small, cumulative doses of arsenic. It was a poison that built up in the body over time, mimicking the symptoms of a progressive neurological disorder. Judy had turned her own son into a living prop for her ongoing performance of tragic motherhood, all while collecting on a military disability insurance policy she had taken out on him. In 1980, Judy decided the performance was over. She took Michael out on a canoe trip on the East River. In a secluded spot, she pushed him overboard. Weighed down by his heavy leg braces, Michael could not swim. He began to drown. But a group of teenagers happened to be nearby. They heard his cries, rescued him from the water, and saved his life. Michael, recovering in the hospital, told the authorities a confusing story. He said he had been reaching for something when the canoe capsized. He did not, or could not, accuse his mother. It was written off as a tragic accident. Judy now had another life insurance policy on Michael, and she was determined to collect. The poisoning continued. His health, already ravaged, deteriorated further. A few months after the canoeing accident, Michael Goodyear, at the age of 19, died. The cause of death was attributed to complications from his long-standing illness and the near drowning. No one questioned the devoted mother who had cared for him through his long, painful decline. By 1983, Judy Benuano had a new fiancé, a prominent Pensacola businessman named John Gentry. Gentry was a successful man, and Judy, ever the pragmatist, saw a lucrative opportunity. She convinced him to take out a substantial life insurance policy, naming her as the beneficiary. Not long after, she began giving him vitamins, pills she claimed would help with his health. In June 1983, John Gentry got into his car and turned the ignition. The car exploded. A powerful bomb had been wired to the engine. Miraculously, Gentry survived the blast, though he was severely injured. While he was recovering in the hospital, police began to investigate the bombing. They were initially baffled. Gentry had no known enemies. It was Gentry himself who provided the crucial clue. As he lay in his hospital bed, he thought about the strange vitamin pills his fiancée had been giving him. He told the police about them. Investigators took the remaining pills for analysis. They were not vitamins. They contained a potent mixture of arsenic and paraformaldehyde. The truth began to dawn on the police. The car bomb was not a random act of violence. It was a failed murder attempt, and the prime suspect was the woman who stood to gain from his death. The investigation into Judy Benuano began. The detectives in Pensacola were tenacious. They started to look into her past, a past littered with dead men and insurance claims. They contacted authorities in Colorado about the death of Bobby Joe Morris. They spoke with investigators in Orlando about James Goodyear. They began the process of exhuming the bodies. The autopsies revealed what Judy had so carefully concealed for over a decade. The bodies of James Goodyear, Bobby Joe Morris, and her son, Michael, were all found to contain lethal quantities of arsenic. The mysterious illnesses, the tragic deaths, the string of bad luck kit was all a lie. It was a trail of slow, deliberate poisoning, a career of murder for profit. The media dubbed her the Black Widow. The case against her was overwhelming. The failed car bombing had been her undoing, a single, loud act of violence that exposed her lifetime of silent, patient killing. Judy Benuano was tried and convicted in 3 separate trials. In 1984, she was convicted of the attempted murder of John Gentry. In 1985, she was tried for the murder of her son, Michael, and became the first woman in Florida's history to be sentenced to death. Later, she was also convicted of the murder of her first husband, James Goodyear. She was never tried for the death of Bobby Joe Morris, but authorities in Colorado closed the case, convinced of her guilt. For years, Judy Benuano sat on death row, maintaining her innocence, a grandmotherly figure who insisted she was the victim of a terrible misunderstanding. But the evidence was undeniable. She was a woman who had systematically eliminated every significant man in her life: 2 husbands, a boyfriend, and even her own son for the cold, hard currency of an insurance check. Her love was a lure, her care was a weapon, and her grief was a performance. On March 30th, 1998, at the Florida State Prison, Judy Benawana was executed in the electric chair. She was the first woman to be executed in Florida in 150 years. Her death marked the end of a story that was a chilling testament to the depths of human greed, a story of a woman who wore the mask of a victim while leaving a trail of bodies in her wake, a true Black Widow whose web was spun with arsenic and lies. Case 3. The Buried Husbands of Gun Barrel City. A Texas woman murders 2 husbands, burying them in her own yard. There are places whose names seem to carry a certain weight, a hint of the character of the people who live there. Gun Barrel City, a small, working-class community in East Texas, is one such place. It is a town built on hard-bitten independence, a place of mobile homes and lakeside fishing spots, where life is practical and unadorned. It was here, in a modest trailer home on a plot of land, that Betty Lou Beets lived a life that, to her neighbors, seemed defined by resilience and a remarkable string of bad luck and love. She was seen as a tough, resilient woman, a 5-time wife and a mother who had endured more than her share of hardship. The truth, however, was that Betty Lou's hardship was largely self-inflicted, and her bad luck in love was a carefully managed enterprise that ended with a shallow grave in her own front yard. Betty Lou's early life was one of instability and poverty, setting a pattern of turbulent relationships that would define her adulthood. By the early 1980s, she had already been married and divorced 4 times. Her 4th husband was a man named Doyle Wayne Barker. Their marriage, like the ones before it, was reportedly fraught with conflict. Then, in 1981, Doyle Wayne Barker disappeared. Betty Lou told her children and anyone who asked that he had simply run off, another man who couldn't handle commitment. No one questioned it. Men left. It happened. Not long after his disappearance, Betty Lou used one of her ex-husband's disability checks to purchase a new boat. Life for her moved on. In 1982, Betty Lou married for the 5th time. Her new husband was Jimmy Don Beets, a captain in the Dallas Fire Department. He was a respected man, a hero in his community, a figure of stability and strength. For Betty Lou, the marriage seemed to be a chance at a new, more respectable life. They lived together in her trailer home in Gun Barrel City. Jimmy Don was a kind stepfather to Betty Lou's children from her previous marriages. For a time, it seemed as though she had finally found a lasting partnership. But the pattern was destined to repeat itself. On August 6, 1983, Jimmy Don Beets, a man who had spent his life running into burning buildings to save others, was about to face a danger he never saw coming, in the one place he should have been safe, his own home. According to the story Betty Lou would later tell, the couple had planned to go fishing that day. Jimmy Don, feeling tired, decided to take a nap before they left. While he slept, Betty Lou Beets made a decision. She retrieved a .38 caliber pistol. She walked into the bedroom where her husband was resting, a man who had given her his name and his trust, and shot him twice. He died there in his bed. The act was not one of passion. It was one of cold, pragmatic execution. The murder, however, created a logistical problem: the body. For this, Betty Lou enlisted the help of her own son, Robert Branson. In an act of profound maternal corruption, she coerced her son into helping her move his dead stepfather's body. Together, they wrapped Jimmy Don's body in a sleeping bag, dragged it out of the trailer and buried it in the front yard. They concealed the makeshift grave beneath a newly built storage shed. For the next 2 years, Betty Lou Beets lived a lie. She told Jimmy Don's family and his colleagues at the fire department that he had left her, just as Doyle Wayne Barker had done. She played the part of the abandoned, long-suffering wife. She collected Jimmy Don's pension and disability benefits, a steady stream of income that was the clear motive for his murder. The community, for the most part, believed her story. The disappearances of 2 of her husbands were seen not as a suspicious pattern, but as a testament to her poor luck with men. The past, however, has a way of refusing to stay buried. In June of 1985, Henderson County law enforcement received an anonymous tip. The informant claimed that the missing firefighter, Jimmy Don Beets, had not run off. He was buried in the yard of his wife's home in Gun Barrel City. The informant, it would later be revealed, was Betty Lou's son, finally breaking under the weight of the secret he had been forced to keep. Police descended on the small property. Their search began with a peculiar landmark in the front yard, an ornamental wishing well. It seemed like a quaint, domestic touch, but the informant had suggested they look beneath it. When officers removed the well, they found a concrete slab. They broke through the concrete and began to dig. A few feet down, they found it, a sleeping bag, bundled and tied. Inside were the remains of Jimmy Don Beets. The discovery of one body immediately raised the question of the other, missing husband. The informant's tip had also mentioned Doyle Wayne Barker. The search expanded. Investigators turned their attention to the storage shed, the very shed that had been built over Jimmy Don's initial grave. They began to dig beneath it. And there, they found a second body, also wrapped in a sleeping bag. The remains were identified as those of Doyle Wayne Barker. The quiet, lakeside property had been a graveyard. Betty Lou's front yard, the place where her children played, was the final resting place for the men she had sworn to love. The murder yard, as it became known, had given up its secrets. Betty Lou Beets was arrested and charged with the murder of Jimmy Don Beets. At her trial, her defense team argued that she was a victim of battered woman syndrome, claiming that both Jimmy Don and her previous husbands had been physically abusive and that she had killed in self-defense. They painted a portrait of a woman pushed to the brink by years of domestic violence. The prosecution painted a very different picture. They presented a woman driven not by fear, but by greed. They detailed the insurance policies, the pension benefits, the disability checks, and they presented their star witnesses, Betty Lou's own children. Her son, Robert Branson, testified through tears, recounting the horrific night he was forced to help bury his stepfather. Her daughter, Shirley Stegner, testified that her mother had talked about killing Jimmy Don, at one point casually remarking, "I'm going to kill him," while he was napping. She also testified that her mother had tried to shoot a previous husband. The testimony of her children was devastating. It shattered the defense's claims of self-defense and revealed a woman who is not a victim, but a cold-blooded and calculating predator. The jury found Betty Lou Beets guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to death. For 15 years, Betty Lou Beets sat on death row in Texas, maintaining her innocence and continuing to claim that she was the true victim. She became a cause célèbre for anti-death penalty advocates, who argued that her case was a miscarriage of justice, that the evidence of abuse had been ignored. But the courts consistently upheld her conviction. On February 24, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was executed by lethal injection. Her final statement was one of defiant denial. "I just want my family to know that I love them," she said, "and I'll be with my Lord and my 2 husbands that I did not kill." The case of Betty Lou Beets is a stark and brutal story of domestic homicide. She was a black widow who used the veneer of victimhood as both her shield and her justification. She was a predator who operated not in the shadows, but in the glaring Texas sun, turning her own home into a burial ground. The greatest tragedy of her story is not just the loss of the men she murdered, but the corruption of her own children, whom she forced to become silent accomplices to her crimes, and whose eventual, painful testimony was the only way to bring her dark secrets into the light. Case 4. The Antifreeze Killer's Cruel Deception. A woman poisons her husband and tries to frame her daughter for the crimes. The poisoner's art is one of profound deception, a method of murder that allows the killer to feign care and concern while their victim slowly fades away. In the case of Stacy Castor, this deception was a multi-layered masterpiece of manipulation, a story that involved not only the slow, agonizing poisoning of her husband's, but also a final, cruel attempt to frame her own daughter for her crimes, turning a family tragedy into a twisted, real-life horror script. The story unfolds in the suburban landscape of central New York. In the late 1990s, Stacy was married to her high school sweetheart, Michael Wallace. They had 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree. To the outside world, they were a typical young family. But in 1999, Michael began to suffer from a mysterious, intermittent illness. He would be fine one day, then bedridden the next with violent coughing fits and a sense of profound disorientation. Doctors were unable to find a clear cause, attributing his symptoms to a persistent flu or an inner ear problem. In late 2000, his condition worsened dramatically. He was found dead in their home. The family, including Stacy, told authorities that Michael had a history of heart problems. The death, while sudden, was not initially seen as suspicious. The medical examiner, without performing a full toxicology screen, ruled the cause of death to be a heart attack. Stacy Wallace, at the age of 32, was a widow, left to raise her 2 young daughters alone. Life moved on. Stacy collected a life insurance payout and, a few years later, she found love again. She married David Castor, a man who owned an air conditioning installation and repair company. Stacy began working as his office manager. For a time, their life together seemed happy and stable. David was a good stepfather to Ashley and Bree. But in August of 2005, the pattern began to repeat itself. David Castor fell ill. He became lethargic, started vomiting, and seemed to lose his coordination. Stacy, the devoted wife, was by his side, caring for him. One afternoon, after a day of feeling particularly unwell, David drank a glass of antifreeze-laced cranberry juice that Stacy had prepared for him. He fell into a deep, unresponsive state. The next day, after not hearing from him, one of his employees went to the house. He found David Castor dead in his bed. This time, Stacy's performance of grief was elaborate. She called 911, and in a hysterical voice, she told the operator that her husband had locked himself in the bedroom and was not responding. She claimed he had been depressed and that she was worried he had taken his own life. When police arrived, they found a scene that seemed to support her story. Near the bed was a glass containing a greenish liquid and a container of antifreeze. It looked like a clear-cut case of suicide. But the investigators from the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office were sharp. Something about the scene felt wrong. It was too neat, too staged. They noticed that there were no fingerprints on the glass or the antifreeze container, not even David's. A person committing suicide does not typically wipe down their own suicide weapon. Their suspicions were further aroused when they found a turkey baster in the kitchen trash, a tool that could be used to force-feed a liquid to someone. The autopsy confirmed their suspicions. David Castor had died of ethylene glycol poisoning, the primary component of antifreeze. but the evidence at the scene suggested he had not administered it himself. The police were no longer investigating a suicide. They were investigating a homicide, and Stacey Castor was their only suspect. The investigation into David's death led police to re-examine the death of Stacey's first husband, Michael Wallace. They exhumed his body. The subsequent autopsy revealed what had been missed years earlier. Michael Wallace had also died from ethylene glycol poisoning. The heart attack was a misdiagnosis. Stacey Castor was not a two-time widow cursed by bad luck. She was a serial murderer. As the investigation tightened around her, Stacey realized she needed to create a diversion, a new suspect to deflect the blame. In a final, desperate act of malevolent cunning, she chose her own eldest daughter, Ashley. In September 2007, Ashley, then 20 years old, received a call from her mother. Stacey was upset, telling Ashley that the police were closing in and that she needed her support. She invited Ashley to come to their home to drink together, to talk. That evening, the mother and daughter shared a few drinks. Stacey gave Ashley a drink in a glass that she had secretly laced with a powerful cocktail of crushed prescription pills. The next morning, Ashley's younger sister, Bree, found her unconscious in her bed. Beside her was a typed 750-word note. It was a suicide note and a confession. In the note, Ashley confessed to murdering her father, Michael Wallace, and her stepfather, David Castor, by poisoning them with antifreeze. The note was filled with guilt and remorse. "I am the one who is sick," the letter read. "I am the one that is a monster." Ashley was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. She had suffered a massive overdose and was in a coma. For a few agonizing days, it was unclear if she would survive. But she did. When she finally regained consciousness, she told a story that horrified the police. She remembered her mother giving her a nasty-tasting drink. She remembered her mother's words just before she passed out. "You're a disgusting person." She had no memory of writing a suicide note. She had not tried to kill herself. The police now had the final, damning piece of the puzzle. They examined the supposed suicide note. Forensic analysis of the document revealed that it was not written by Ashley. It had been created on Stacey's computer. The text contained several instances of the word anti-free, a peculiar typo that matched an earlier written statement Stacey had given to police. Furthermore, investigators found Stacey's fingerprints on the glass from which Ashley had drunk. The note was a fabrication. The suicide attempt was a staged murder attempt. Stacey Castor had tried to kill her own daughter and frame her for 2 murders to save herself. In 2009, Stacey Castor went on trial for the murder of David Castor and the attempted murder of her daughter, Ashley. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Fitzpatrick, laid out the entire, chilling narrative for the jury. They called her the Black Widow, a woman who killed for financial gain and was willing to sacrifice her own child to escape justice. The star witness was Ashley Wallace. In a moment of high courtroom drama, she took the stand and testified against her own mother. She recounted the night of the poisoning, the bitter taste of the drink, the cruel words her mother spoke. Her testimony was a powerful and heartbreaking account of a daughter's ultimate betrayal. The jury found Stacey Castor guilty. She was sentenced to 25 years to life for the murder of David Castor and another 25 years for the attempted murder of her daughter. She was never tried for the murder of Michael Wallace, as the authorities felt her existing sentence was sufficient. Stacey Castor died in prison in 2016 of a heart attack, the very cause of death she had faked for her first husband. Her story remains a chilling case study in manipulation and maternal malevolence. She was a Black widow who did not just consume her mates. She attempted to consume her own offspring in a desperate, final act of self-preservation. Her crimes were a profound violation of the most sacred trusts, that of a wife to her husband, and, most unforgivably, that of a mother to her child. Case 5. The Murder Factory Matron. A nursing home owner poisons residents and husbands for their money. The nursing home, in our collective imagination, is a place of final refuge, a sanctuary where the elderly and infirm are meant to receive care, comfort, and a dignified end to their lives. But in the small, unassuming town of Walker, Michigan in the 1980s, one such facility became something else entirely. It became a factory of death, a place where the line between caregiving and predation was not just blurred, but obliterated. The matron of this facility was a woman named Catherine May Wood, and her business was not care, it was murder, practiced on an almost industrial scale, with her husbands as just another set of profitable victims. Catherine Wood, along with her girlfriend and employee Gwendolyn Graham, ran the Alpine Manor nursing home. On the surface, it was a typical elder care facility. But beneath the veneer of medical charts and quiet corridors, a horrific secret was unfolding. Wood and Graham were engaged in a sadistic game. They would select elderly, often frail and Alzheimer's-afflicted residents as their victims, people whose deaths would be unlikely to raise suspicion. They would then murder them, usually by suffocation with a washcloth, a silent, untraceable method. They turned their game into a competition, keeping a tally of their victims, spelling out the word murder with the first letter of each victim's last name. It was an act of profound, chilling depravity, killing for sport. While the story of the Alpine Manor serial killings is a case of its own, it provides the crucial, terrifying context for Catherine Wood's career as a Black Widow. Her capacity for murder was not limited to the vulnerable residents under her care. It extended to the men she married, men who, like her patients, were seen not as partners, but as assets to be liquidated. By the time the Alpine Manor investigation began in 1988, Catherine Wood had been married 5 times. 2 of her husbands had died under circumstances that, in retrospect, were deeply suspicious. The investigation into the nursing home deaths prompted police to look closer at the trail of dead men in Catherine's past. Her second husband was a man named Jack T. Wood. He died in 1982. At the time, his death was attributed to a heart attack. He was a heavy smoker, and the diagnosis seemed plausible. No autopsy was performed. Catherine, the grieving widow, collected on his life insurance policy. A few years later, she married again. Her 4th husband was Ken Wood, no relation to her second husband. Ken was an employee at the Alpine Manor, a maintenance man who worked under Catherine. In 1985, Ken also died suddenly. This time, the story was that he had accidentally electrocuted himself while working on a piece of equipment at the nursing home. The death was ruled an accident. Catherine, a widow for the second time, collected another insurance payout. The pattern was clear, but it was obscured by the chaos of the much larger investigation into the nursing home murders. The case against Wood and Graham for the deaths of their residents was built on the confession of Gwendolyn Graham's ex-husband, who told police that Graham had admitted to the killings. When confronted, Catherine Wood, in an attempt to secure a plea deal, agreed to testify against her former lover. She admitted her own role in the murders of 5 residents, painting Graham as the sadistic ringleader and herself as a reluctant, manipulated accomplice. Her testimony was crucial in convicting Graham, who was sentenced to life in prison. Catherine Wood received a sentence of 20 to 40 years. It was during her time in prison for these crimes that investigators, still troubled by the deaths of her husbands, decided to press her further. They believed that the deaths of Jack and Ken Wood were not a heart attack and an accident. They were murders, committed with the same cold, financial motive as her other crimes. In 2004, Nearly 2 decades after the death of her last husband, investigators from the Kent County Sheriff's Department interviewed Catherine Wood in prison. Faced with the evidence they had compiled, and perhaps with nothing left to lose, she confessed. She admitted that she had murdered her fourth husband, Ken Wood. The electrocution story was a complete fabrication. She confessed that she had intentionally given him an overdose of her own heart medication, a drug called Lanoxin, a brand name for digoxin. It was a poison that was difficult to detect and whose effects could mimic a heart attack. She had watched him die and then staged the scene to look like an accident. Her motive was simple: greed. She wanted the insurance money. The confession to Ken Wood's murder immediately cast the death of her second husband, Jack Wood, in a new, sinister light. His heart attack now seemed highly suspicious. Investigators believed she had likely used the same digoxin overdose to kill him as well. The symptoms would have been identical, leading to the same convenient misdiagnosis. While Catherine never formally confessed to this murder, the authorities were convinced she was responsible. The pattern, the method, and the motive were a perfect match. The case of Catherine May Wood is a chilling portrait of a predator whose murderous impulses were not confined to a single category of victim. She was a woman who saw human life as a commodity. Her patients were disposable, their deaths a source of sadistic sport. Her husbands were equally disposable, their lives worth the value of their insurance policies. She was a healthcare provider who dealt in death, a wife whose vows were a prelude to poisoning. Her story forces a re-examination of the Black Widow archetype. She was not a glamorous seductress or a master of subtle manipulation. She was a plain, matronly figure, a woman in a position of trust who used that trust as her primary weapon. She operated a literal murder factory, and her husbands were simply two more products on her assembly line of death. Catherine Wood was eventually paroled from prison in January 2021, after serving over 30 years. Her release was met with outrage from the families of her many victims. She had admitted to participating in at least 6 murders, and was suspected of many more. Her story is a testament to a chilling reality, that the most prolific killers are sometimes the ones who are closest to us, who hold our hands and promise to care for us, all while waiting for the perfect moment to administer a final, fatal dose. The Black Widow is a predator who perfects the art of the intimate kill. She turns the trust of a marital bond into her most effective weapon. Through patience, deception, and a profound coldness of heart, she transforms the men who love her into financial assets to be liquidated. The stories of these women are a chilling reminder that the greatest danger does not always come from a stranger, but can be found in the person who shares your home, your life, and your name, all while quietly planning your demise for a profit. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well and stay safe.